Okay, so a little bit of a roadmap for today's training, everyone. First, we're going to start with generally a charter school overview. We will certainly hit charter school enrollment. We'll also talk about promotion policies and academic supports in charter schools. We will then move on to special education in charter schools. And then last, but certainly not least, we will be discussing discipline policies in charter schools. Okay, so before we jump in, a quick question, trivia question. Following slide, please. Or I'm sorry, the previous slide. Okay. First question. Which of the following is true about a charter school? One, it is a type of public school. Two, it generally operates independent of the New York City Department of Education. Three, it operates under a charter, which is to be renewed every 5 years. Or four, all of the above. Please put your answer in the chat. Which of the following is true? Okay, still waiting on some answers. So someone be the brave first soul to put it in the chat. Okay, thank you, Tiana. Four. Okay, I'm seeing all of the above. Another four as well. All right, great job, everyone. The answer is four, all of the above. Charter schools are independent public schools, excuse me. They are not operated by the local DOE because of the independence that they have, right? However, they do receive public funding from the state and from the federal government. Charter schools, everyone, are tuition free, which means that parents, guardians do not pay for their child, for their student to attend the charter school. They are established upon the submission and the granting of a charter by the state's Department of Education. And there are certainly state laws that charter schools must abide by, everyone, in order to continue operations. However, something that we will talk about today is that unfortunately, charter schools do not always abide by these laws, these regulations. One of the laws and regulations, for instance, that are promulgated for the purpose of, or for charter schools specifically to follow, is that they must be renewed, their charter must be renewed every 5 years. Next slide. Okay. Another trivia question, because I know we're just doing so well here. What percentage of students attend New York City charter schools? Again, please put all answers in the chat. What percentage of students attend New York City charter schools, folks? A, about 5%, B, about 8%, C, about 10%, or D, about 15%. This is a hard one. So let's see how it goes. Okay, I'm seeing some responses come in. Loving what I'm seeing thus far. All right, for the sake of time, we will definitely move on, but the correct answer here is D, everyone. About 15% of New York City's students attend charter schools, which is really interesting given the fact that New York City, everyone actually houses the largest Department of Education, right? And we know that now we know public schools, excuse me, charter schools are independent public schools, right? So according to New York City Charter School Center, 150,500 students attend charter school in New York City, or about 15.2% of all students in public schools. Some other important facts. 82.9% of enrolled students identify as economically disadvantaged. 11.4% of enrolled students live in temporary housing. And about 19.3% of enrolled students have individual education programs or IEPs, which we will be certainly talking about later today. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the charter school enrollment process. How does one get their child to a charter school? As we know, charter schools are tuition-free public schools, essentially, right? During any given year, if a charter school's number of applicants exceeds the number of available seats, then that charter school, everyone, is legally obligated to conduct a random lottery to ensure all of its seats are filled. According to the New York City Charter School Center, individuals can apply for charter schools by using an online application known as the Common Online Charter School Application. You can submit one application, and that one application, folks, will then be sent to multiple charter schools via this platform. However, please note that not all charter school networks opt into this platform, which means that not all charter schools, you can apply to all charter schools in the city via this one platform. So in order to ensure that, the charter school you are interested in is the one that you apply to, make sure you check the policies, right? You certainly communicate with the school if you find that they are not, or their application is not on this common online website. In addition, you can visit the charter school's website and apply directly via the website, or stop by the charter school's front desk to inquire about an application.
Kira, just to go back one section, we did
Mhm.
have a question in the chat as to just the statistic on how many students in charter schools have IAPs, or what percentage IAPs?
Sure, I'm happy to definitely state that. So, about 19.3% of students in charter schools have IEPs. This number, though, does reflect data as of earlier this year, or this school year, rather. So, as of fall of 2025, that certainly could have changed in the months since then. But the latest data that we are relaying to you all today is about 19.3 percent of students, excuse me. Thanks, Allison. So, what should stand out about a charter school lottery system, right? Well, one, the fact that it's a lottery system. So, if folks have experience with the New York City Department of Education, most schools seemingly do not have lottery systems. Some public schools do have specialized, application processes where students may need to test in or in order to opt into that school or have a chance at securing a seat for that school. But lottery systems is not something that we hear about much in New York City, right? Well, one, in terms of the charter school lottery system, it should be bias free. A lottery system is more capable of ridding the selection process of favoritism, bias, or discrimination, arguably, excuse me. And number two, no entry examination, right? We know that exams are not everyone's forte, and that is a-okay. This lottery process certainly eliminates the need for competitive examinations, which we may see for other public schools, right? And as we know, many of these evaluations or many of these examinations certainly don't demonstrate a student's true intellectual capacities. However, I do want to recognize, acknowledge, and remind our audience today that the lottery system is not perfect, folks, okay? Each charter school network may take other factors into consideration when conducting the lottery, so please make sure you research and familiarize yourself with the process beforehand. For instance, I do know that when it comes to some charter schools, it may be easier for families who have already established a relationship with that charter school. For instance, maybe an older child, right, older sibling happens to already have a seat at that school to perhaps get a younger child in. But that's something to definitely keep in mind. Certainly not the case for all networks, but may be the case for some. Okay, a very, very hot topic, promotion policy and student supports within charter schools. Okay. So each charter school sets its own promotion or academic policy. Definitely be sure to ask for policies before actual enrollment. Okay. And a way in which you can do that, right? For instance, let's say that you end up using that online application process or online application system to apply to that charter school. You find that your child gets in, and you may not be able to ask questions, right, or inquire using that online system. Certainly reach out to the charter school if you have questions. Charter schools should also, folks, have what's known as their specific handbook public, and that handbook should be on their website, and or that handbook should certainly be readily available to you if you do ask for it. Maybe you actually go to the building, you email, you inquire about it. And within that handbook, they should certainly have policies related to actual promotion. However, if you don't find information regarding those promotion policies, definitely make sure you reach out to an administrator at that school. All right. So, one of the things that we talk about when we think about promotion, right, at least when we think about it in a charter school context, is certainly students moving on to other grades. But a lot of the conversation regarding charter schools also um, focuses on high holdover rates. Okay. So, because charter schools act as independent public schools, they control or they can control a lot of what's happening internally and externally with the school, right? And when we think about what's happening internally, we may think about, right, test scores, testing, what's going on there, attendance, higher passing grades, or just grades in general to be promoted or move on to another grade. So again, these are some of the things that you certainly want to consider when you're thinking about perhaps applying to a charter school for your child, right? Make sure you're very clear on the policies. And again, I do want to reiterate that those policies regarding promotions should be readily available, either in that handbook and or if they're not in that handbook, make sure you ask those questions for sure.
Quick question. Kira, there's a question. Does the application limit who can apply? For example, only students from a specific area or part of the city?
That's a great question. So it's my understanding that there is not a limitation for families within New York City. I do believe that if you are outside the city, and when I say outside the city, I mean specifically like the tri-state area, right, in New York or New Jersey. However, right, these charter schools are for charter schools in the New York City area. And so they'll ask on the application is location, specifically address, right, where you live, mailing address, things of that nature. So definitely take that into consideration when looking at the website. But I don't believe there are those sorts of limitations. Great question.
But there may be preferences, right? There may be a neighborhood preference or a certain focus that the charter school may have, but not a
Exactly.
limitation, I think.
Yes. Thanks for clarifying, Allison.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're, oh,
Did
perfect.
I fun?
I think that actually, Allison, can you just go back to the previous slide? I think there may have been okay. So I do want to just quickly talk about mid-year demotions. Thanks so much. So again, this certainly, right, follows up or is tied to the conversation of promotions. Something that you, again, often comes up when having that conversation regarding charter schools is the promotion policies. One of those things being mid-year demotions. And so what I mean about a mid-year demotion, everyone, is let's say we have a student who started at their charter school in September, and perhaps maybe by December, right, the school may find that the child is not doing as well as the school would expect them to do. Now, before a child's classroom is moved, changed, shifted, before a child is demoted, there should certainly be conversations had with the actual family. Okay. So definitely, again, don't think that you don't have any power, you don't have, any opportunity, or you don't have any opportunity to probably, to perhaps have conversations with the school and change their decision. As families, you certainly should have that power. Okay. And definitely, if you find that your child was demoted mid-year, certainly make sure that you reach out to the charter school and you speak with administrators. Next slide, please. Okay. A very important question. Does immigration status of family matter? No. Your child has the right to go to school regardless of his or her or their immigration status or your family's immigration status. No one can ask you about your immigration status. If someone knows, and when I say someone, I mean an administrator, a teacher, right, within the school building, if they know, they must keep it confidential. If a document asks for a social security number, simply leave it blank. In addition, students are entitled to receive all school services, including free lunch, free breakfast, transportation, and educational services, even if they or their family members are undocumented. So again, I just want to reiterate everyone, immigration status of of family members of the student themselves should not matter when applying to a charter school and or when actually enrolled at a charter school, okay? Your child has a right to school regardless of their immigration status and regardless of the family's immigration status. Next slide. Okay, trivia. We've been doing great with the trivia thus far, folks. Let's keep it up. Third question for you. And again, please put your answers in the chat. What percentage of students in New York City charter schools are multilingual or English language learners, ELL learners? A, about 20%, B, about 16%, C, about 11%, or D, about 7%? Okay, seeing some answers. Come in. I love the engagement, everyone. Great job. Okay. All right. So the answer here, folks, is C, about 11%. According to the New York City Charter School Center, 11.1% of enrolled students identify as multilingual learners, which is about, everyone, a 4% increase since the 2020 to 2021 school year. Very exciting. We know that New York City is a diverse city, and we certainly see that diversity within our education system, and I certainly love to see that. Oh, Tiana, I see your comment in the chat. I totally understand that. I can certainly see the surprise there, especially given the fact that New York City is certainly one of the most diverse cities in in the world, excuse me. So let's see. Perhaps the rate will be higher next year, but right now the data that we have on file is about 11%. Okay. Great. So, charter schools must provide English language learning instruction to help students achieve the same educational goals as all students. Now, I'm going to get into some New York State regulations, everyone, regarding ELL multilingual learners, right? The first being the New York State Ed Commissioner's Regulations, Part 154. Again, all school districts are accountable for identifying and serving English language learners, ELLs, by law. School districts are required to implement policies related to the education of ELLs in order to ensure that they have the opportunity to achieve the same educational goals and standards as non-ELL students. Each school district, folks, must provide ELLs with equal access to all school programs and services offered by the school district. School districts shall provide English language learners with bilingual education or English programs. Excuse me. Okay. The law also specifically requires charter schools to implement bilingual education, right? Or English language learning programs, or some other sort of research-based language programs approved by the charter authorizer. Many schools fall into this camp. Unfortunately, some of these programs, some programs that are implemented are not evidence-based and may not amount to much support. However, do know that by law, they should be offering programs that have some sort of scientific backing to demonstrate that students, right, can learn from these programs. Now, while charter schools have some flexibility in how they set up these English language learning programs, this instruction, again, must enable them. When I say them, I mean students who are English language learners, right, to develop academically while achieving competence in English. This is certainly important. Next slide, please. Okay. English or excuse me, language access rights, right? Let's talk about translation and let's talk about interpretation. So, all families have a right to translated materials, okay, within the New York City charter school system. This includes letters, this includes forms, this includes meeting notices, report cards, and special education documents. When I say special education documents, can someone maybe put in the chat an example of what kind of special education document am I specifically thinking about that a family may need translation of? We're certainly going to talk about this document later, but let's see. What special education documents do you think families should have access to or translations of? Okay, I see a 504 plan. Definitely. Procedural safeguards. Marianne, I love that for sure. We'll be talking about those later. IEP, 504 intervention, medical info. Great. Seeing some really great responses, folks. Thanks so much for your engagement. Okay, definitely. Those are certainly special education documents that should be translated. Now, interpretation, right? Right, you have a right to interpreter services or an interpreter when it comes to parent-teacher conferences, when it comes to IEP meetings, certainly when it comes to a suspension hearing, right? Or appellate matters perhaps related to a suspension or a suspension decision, excuse me. Special education hearings, meetings at any DOE office. Okay, these are opportunities, these are instances, events where interpretation should be provided to you. Next slide, please. Okay, now we are going to get into talking a bit more about students with disabilities in our charter schools. Next slide. But as we always do before we jump into a new section, really quickly, some trivia. Again, as always, folks, thanks so much for your engagement. Please continue to put your responses in the chat. Okay, true or false? Charter schools must provide the services on a student's IEP. A, true, or B, false? Seeing some wonderful responses. Excellent. Perfect. So for the sake of time, we're gonna discuss the answer to this question. The answer is certainly true. A, true. Charter schools must provide the services on a student's IEP. And we will certainly discuss in following slides what options charter schools families have if the charter school perhaps communicates to the family that they might not have certain services internally. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about an IEP. Folks have put that keyword in the chat. What exactly is an IEP? Well, an IEP is known as an individual education program, and an IEP is provided to children who are deemed as special education students and or students with disabilities. This IEP is a legal document. It's a legal education document specifically. And oftentimes, what this document outlines is that child's disability classification, which is what you'll find on the first page in the top right-hand corner. And then Throughout the IEP, there'll be a discussion about the student themselves, right? So about perhaps the student's scores on different evaluations, right? The student's social history, the student's social needs, recommended educational programs for that student, recommended educational services for that student. When I talk about recommended educational services, I'm thinking, what kind of classroom should that student be in, right? So charter schools offer a host of different classrooms. Public schools offer a host of different classrooms. We have our general education classroom. We have our integrated co-teaching classroom, also known as ICT. We have more restrictive settings, right? A 12 to 1 classroom, perhaps. So oftentimes what you'll find on that document, what should be on that document, is the recommended classroom for that student, as well as other recommended services. And when I say other recommended services, folks, I'm talking about related services specifically, right, that are tied to that student's needs. This may be occupational therapy. This may be counseling. This may be speech language therapy. This may be physical therapy, right? Extra resources, extra supports that, again, that child certainly needs. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the IEP process in charter schools. How are IEPs created? How can a family who may find themselves in need of special education services for their child, for their charter school student, how can they get those services? Right? So the IEP process is can be a long one for sure, but is a pretty clear process. Okay, so I want to make sure that that is certainly highlighted and emphasized. Students with disabilities in charter schools who need an individualized education program, IEP, follow the same process as students in district schools. Okay, when I say district schools, folks, I'm specifically referring to public schools, right? First, we have a referral, right? That referral may come from the student's teacher, for instance. A teacher may notice some things about the student, how they're performing in class, perhaps how they're behaving in class, and may speak to the parent or should be speaking to the parent, to the guardian about that student's, what's happening in classroom pertaining to that student, right? So we have that referral that comes from a school administrator, a teacher. Next, we have consent. Consent is specifically to be provided, right, by a student's parent, a student's guardian. And this consent specifically is for the Department of Education, the CSE, the Committee on Special Education, to evaluate that student, right? So we don't just kind of jump to an IEP upon maybe observing a child and seeing that they may need services. That student does need to be evaluated first, okay? And so that consent comes in when we think about that evaluation. After that evaluation, we then should have IEP development. Okay. And as a part of the IEP development process, this is where an IEP meeting should be called. An IEP meeting, we'll talk about that later, but again, that's a meeting that should be called upon a student being evaluated. After having that IEP meeting, at that point in time, the actual IEP itself, the document itself, should be issued, and placement and services should begin for the student. Okay. Please do note, and we will talk about this later, but I do want to emphasize this now since we just spoke about language access at charter schools and access to interpretation and translation. IEP documents again are documents that should be translated. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. So evaluations in charter schools. Again, the Department of Education evaluates students. So I want to talk a little bit about um, administrative, I guess, organization or how or who oversees special education in charter schools. So as we know, all right, at the beginning of this presentation, we spoke about how charter schools themselves are technically independent public schools, and their administrators, their board, their charter governs a lot of things that happen internally and externally. However, the Department of Education is still certainly involved in charter school life. And what I mean by that is the Committee on Special Education, right? which is housed under the Department of Education, they oversee students with disabilities in charter schools. So when if you find that, your student is at a charter school and is in need of special education services, you should certainly be in communication with the school itself, but you should also be in communication with the Department of Education, okay? The Department of Education, again, is the entity that evaluates students. Charter schools can evaluate students, but at DOE discretion specifically. Okay, next slide. Okay, right. Now, let's talk a little bit about some more about IEP development, right? So, one, the charter school must provide student-specific information. Okay, this information is crucial. And when I say student-specific information, I'm talking about evaluations, right? Uh, and when I say evaluations, I mean like internal evaluations and or testing that the student may have completed within the charter school, right? They should share that information with the IEP team during that meeting. That information may perhaps be included in the IEP. Charter school should propose programs and services which require parents' consent, and a parent can cut off these services at any time. That's important to highlight. Special and general education teachers, where appropriate, must attend IEP meetings. Before we move on, I'm interested in knowing whether someone can tell me by putting in the chat, why do we think special and general education teachers must attend, where appropriate, right? That caveat's important, must attend IEP meetings. Why do we think that's important? Feel free to, again, put your responses in the chat. Sure, happy to repeat the question. I see some answers coming in. I'm going to repeat the question just in case as well. Why do we think it's important for special and general education teachers, where appropriate, to attend an IEP meeting for a student? Seeing some great responses, right? So they can provide input related to accessing curriculum. Okay. Seeing some really great responses, right? Give insight regarding the child, provide updates on progress. Fantastic, right? So exactly that. Special education, general education teachers, these are the people, folks who are spending a large portion of the day with your children. They know your children incredibly well, right? They know how they function in certain settings, right? Specifically in academic settings, perhaps in free play settings, right? Like recess. They spend, again, a lot of time with your child and are certainly able to contribute in a meaningful way to the IEP meeting regarding the needs of your child. And the purpose of this IEP meeting is to make sure that the best IEP is developed on behalf of your child to ensure that they can access all of the resources that they need. And so we want to make sure that the people who know them really well, who know, right, their academic history really well, perhaps their social history really well, are present for those meetings so that they can make those meaningful contributions and ultimately help or assist with the creation of an IEP that is great for your child. Okay, really good job, folks. I do want to add this, everyone. So in terms of IEP meetings, these days IEP meetings are happening remotely. Okay, which is great. Um, you know, which is great that folks don't have to travel to get to IEP meetings. So definitely, right, again, if you find that your child may be in need of services, reaching out to the DOE, reaching out to the CSEs for those services, and looking out for that calendar invite for a remote meeting. Okay, next slide, please. All right, let's continue. So the student needs drive the recommendations that are included in the IEP. I'll say it again. A student's needs are what drive recommendations to be included in an IEP, not the services available at the charter school. Okay? What do I mean by this? I mean, hey, the purpose of the meeting is to discuss, right, what that child, what it's important for that child, what resources that child requires in order to best access their education. It's not about what resources the charter school has, it's about what the school needs. If a charter school finds, for instance, say we have an IEP that's issued, an IEP is issued for a student, and that student requires related services such as physical therapy and or occupational therapy, right? PT or OT. Let's say the charter school communicates with the parent and lets them know, hey, we don't have, resources internally. We don't have a PT provider. We don't have an OT provider. It is that charter school's responsibility to make sure that they reach out to the DOE and or to a third party to secure those resources for that child. A charter school is wholly responsible for implementing an IEP, right? And them not having certain resources does not mean they're off the hook for implementing that IEP, okay? Additionally, a parent can invite anyone with knowledge of the child to the IEP meeting. Okay, so if you find that, perhaps a family friend knows your child really well because they may tutor your child on the weekends or they may tutor your child after school, right? So they're familiar with that child's academic history, what their academic ability is. You can consent to them being at the IEP meeting. If you are a non-English speaker, again, very important, you have the right to an interpreter available at the IEP meeting, and you can request that IEP in your language. I would certainly advise you to put in these requests prior to the IEP meeting. However, if you don't do that, that is okay. If you maybe, you get to the meeting and you find, oh goodness, I forgot to request the interpreter, excuse me, that is fine. You can postpone the meeting in order to give the DOE time to secure an interpreter, okay, so that you can best access what's happening at the meeting. Next slide, please. Oh, I do see a question in the chat. As Allison transitions to the next slide, I'll answer this really quickly. What if given a voucher and a book to find a provider yourself? Is it the school's responsibility or the parents? So that's a great question. Sometimes there are vouchers or documents known as RSAs that are provided to families to secure related service providers where the school may not have them. Um, Unfortunately, there are many instances where the parent is on the hook to certainly, one, obtain that RSA and to look through the list of providers that the RSA directs you to and to secure that provider. However, that said, I know in my time at AFC and in my time in this area doing this work, I have assisted families in going in, in securing the RSAs and in going through the list of providers, just to see what provider, may be best for that student. So if you find that, hey, it's pretty hard to kind of navigate this RSA process, I have questions, I don't think I can do this on my own, I need assistance, certainly speak up and speak out. Reach out to your school administrator, right? Reach out to other folks in your community because there are certainly entities out there, individuals out there, excuse me, who are happy to assist. Great question. Okay. All right. So, what must the DOE do in this process, in this IEP process? The DOE must evaluate students, right, to determine their their needs. The DOE must determine eligibility as well for an IEP, right? Revise and amend IEPs where needed, where appropriate, and certainly declassify students. So Just because a student may have an IEP in elementary school does not mean that that student will need that IEP throughout middle school, throughout high school, right? Every year, an IEP meeting should be held for your child, okay? To discuss their progress, to discuss their needs. There may be instances where, you as an integral member of the IEP team, along with other members, you may find that, okay, this student did really well with these supports, but we find that maybe they no longer need these supports. And so at that point in time, the student will be declassified, right, quote unquote, meaning that they will no longer be designated as a special education student, right? They will no longer have an IEP. Charter schools. What must charter schools do? They must provide a program and services to the student directly, right? Or provide the services through a contract agency or ask the DOE to provide services. We know that the second and third bullet points, providing services through a contract agency or asking the DOE to provide services, that happens when the charter school themselves can't provide the student those services. Okay? Um, Really, really important that, again, you recognize everyone that your child has a right to make sure that all aspects of their IEP are implemented. And just because the school tells you, hey, we can't do this, does not mean that they are not on the hook to figure out a way to do so. Next slide, please. Okay. All right. So tying in, IEPs, tying in promotion criteria, which we discussed earlier. So charter schools may use their own promotion criteria for students with IEPs, and request modified promotion criteria on a student's IEP as well. And so when I say modified promotion criteria, what do I mean by this? On the IEP, there is a section that specifically discusses testing, standardized testing, right? And accommodations that are to be provided during testing. During an IEP meeting, the team may find that, hey, um, there are certain accommodations that this child needs to best access um, testing within the building, testing, at the school. This may be extra time. This may be that student needs to be placed in another classroom, a classroom with maybe perhaps a limited amount of students to ensure that they are not distracted. There may be some instances, though, where it's decided that this student may not, right, be in the best position, the best place to take standardized testing. And so what you'll find is that that information may be provided on a student's IEP where it's applicable. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. If you have questions about the special education process in New York City charter schools, you can refer to this guide. This is the New York City Department of Education's Guide to Special Education Procedures for Students Attending Charter Schools, a Shared Path to Success. If I'm not mistaken, everyone, this guide is actually pretty dated, so I do think that it was last revised in about 2019. However, much of that information should be um, still relevant, right? Still pertinent today. Great question, Marianne. Can we drop a link to the chat for the guide, a link in the chat for the guide? Allison, I'm not sure if you have that capability. If not, what we can do is we can certainly email the guide out to all the folks who are on the invite list, okay, after today's presentation. We'll definitely make sure that some way, somehow, you get access to that. Thanks, Marianne, for that question. Okay. In addition to this guide, everyone, you can also visit the New York State Education Department's website, policies, procedures, and resources for all charter schools. That is the specific page where you'll find a lot of updated information regarding charter schools, rules, and regulations. Okay. I think it's important to just add certain information, right? According to the Charter Schools Act, charter schools can hire a certain number of uncertified teachers, college professors, Teach for America teachers who are uncertified, and or anyone who has exceptional business, professional, artistic, athletic, or military experience. So Whereas you may find that with traditional public schools, many of those educators have licenses and or certificates to teach education. That is not the same for charter schools. Okay. And I will provide a personal anecdote. I actually taught at a charter school for 2 years, everyone, prior to enrolling in law school, and I was not certified. And I did teach third and fourth grade. So, again, there are certainly different certification or licensing expectations, requirements for teachers in charter schools. So, certainly something to consider when thinking about enrolling your child there. Okay. And why? Because it's important to understand who is teaching the students, right? And certainly important to make sure that you your student, your child is accessing education the best way they know how. And so again, you may just want to consider that while looking at charter schools and or moving forward with enrolling your child at a charter school. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now we're going to talk about Section 504 and charter schools. So 504 plans, right? That was discussed a little earlier in the chat. And let's talk about, the slight difference between 504 plans and IEPs. So charter schools receive federal funding and are required to follow Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. This means charter schools cannot discriminate against students with disabilities, and charter schools must provide reasonable accommodations to students. When we think about accommodations, right? As I mentioned previously, testing accommodations may be included on an IEP. However, other sorts of accommodations may be included on a Section 504 plan. So let's talk about a 504 plan versus an IEP. And I'm not sure if this material is on the next slide, Allison, so can we just check really quickly? If not, I'll just jump right into it. Thanks so much. Right? Perfect, thanks. So a 504 plan serves a bit of a different purpose, everyone, than an IEP. And IEPs serve as mechanisms that cater to a student's individual needs. Think specialized teaching, right? Remember, we talked about how at that IEP meeting, what's discussed? Evaluations, tests, right? The student's social history, right? Observations of how the student's doing in the classroom and how, their needs may be impacting their ability to access their education. A 504 plan, however, focuses on providing adjustments for a student in an academic setting in order to remove barriers to regular education in school. Okay. So when I think about a 504 plan, I think about other kind of generalized accommodations, right? Perhaps a student, needs to take certain medications, right? And they need to maybe go to the nurse a couple of times a day to take that medication. That information can be included on a 504 plan. Perhaps a student, um, is very much so dysregulated by the noisy environment, right? By being around a whole bunch of kids and a whole bunch of administrators every single day. Perhaps they need headphones to tune out the noise, to tune out those disruptions, and to help them become more regulated. That is also another accommodation that can be included on a Section 504 plan. All right. So, again, when we think about IEP, we think about more so, right, focused on catering to a student's individual needs when it comes to education specifically and making sure that they can access education. When we think about Section 504, certainly still, right, focused on a student accessing education, but in a different way, right, providing more accommodations, I would say, general accommodations. Christine, great point, right? In the chat, vision and hearing problems, health needs. These are certainly things that are taken into consideration when coming up with that 504 plan. Really, really great. Thanks, Christine, for putting that in. Next slide, please. Okay, so adding on, right, we're going to talk about what charter schools should do in terms of informing students, families of the students about their rights to 504 accommodations. But something else I would like to add, everyone, is that parents and or doctors completing the 504, make sure you're specific, right? Make sure you're specific about the types of accommodations that your child needs, whether these are breaks, physical modifications. Maybe the child needs to sit at the front of the classroom because, as you know, to Christine's point, maybe they have, you know, maybe they're nearsighted, maybe right, maybe they're farsighted, and they need some accommodations to help them, right, with the things that are going on with their vision, with their hearing. Certainly want to consider that. Okay, but generally, everyone, charter schools should inform parents of students about their right to 504 accommodations. I am not saying that charter schools are going to come out right, come out right and, you know, state, hey, on the first day, parents, these are your rights. You may find more of this information in that special handbook that should be public, right? Should be on the school's website. But if you do have questions regarding 504 accommodations and how the school handles those accommodations, please make sure you reach out to an administrator. Okay. And you can also request a 504 plan from a charter school. Next slide, please. Okay, everyone. Very, very important topic. Discipline in charter schools. We are now jumping into the section of the portion of our presentation today where we discuss students' rights and protections for students with disabilities when it comes to discipline in these environments. Next slide, please. As we all know, right, when we start a new section or portion of the presentation, we have to do a trivia question. So, another true or false. Charter schools in New York City must follow the DOE's discipline code. A, true, B, false. Feel free to put those responses in the chat. This is a tricky one. So, you know, very, very tricky. Take your time with it for sure. Okay, seeing some engagement in the chat. Tracy and Blair, thank you. Okay, seeing some good stuff. Marianne, I'm seeing it. Really, really interesting comments for sure. For the sake of time, folks, we're gonna dive into the answer. So the answer is B, false. As we mentioned earlier, charter schools are not required to follow local regulations. Um, Charter schools are independent public schools, right? And they're allowed to set their own policies, to Marianne's point, right? They don't follow certain regulations that DOE follows. They don't follow certain policies that DOE follows. They're allowed to create their own discipline code. Next slide, please. Okay. So while charter schools are allowed to set their own discipline code, these policies must be consistent with the requirements of due process and with federal laws and regulations governing placement of students with disabilities. So let's talk about, right, the differences, the similarities, charters between charter schools and the DOE. Charter schools can create their own discipline policies. The DOE's discipline code does not apply. How are they similar? Both must implement, right, federal due process rules. So there are some differences, different discipline codes, but both discipline codes must follow federal due process procedures. Next slide, please. When we think about discipline in charter schools, folks, right, we're talking about suspensions. We're talking about expulsions. Okay, right? So perhaps these suspensions are in school, which means that the student serves time, um, or is suspended, right, while in the building. So they're asked to come into the building, but perhaps they're not allowed to, you know, access their normal academic schedule. Out of school suspensions, right? Well, we see those a lot for sure at AFC. Out of school suspension means that that student is not allowed to come to the building for several days at a time. They can only come back to the building when the school tells them to come back to the building, and or expulsions, meaning that that student is out of that school permanently. We just talked about some legal or lawful suspensions, right? Let's talk about illegal removals. Okay. One, students are suspended for undefined periods, right? This means that, as opposed to the school saying, okay, student A is suspended from Monday to Monday, the school just says student A is suspended, and it's not clear for how long they're suspended. It's not clear when that student, right, can come back to school. Automatic trigger suspensions, right? Automatic suspensions that kick in if a student commits X offense without any additional due process regulations or excuse me, due process protections. Let's think about maybe that three strikes rule, right? Three strikes and you're out. Conditional returns after suspension, right? Where a student can only come back to school, only return to school if they do X, Y, and Z. And then we also have double jeopardy, right? Perhaps the student was previously suspended, right? However, that previous suspension is unrelated to this current suspension, right? Or, excuse me, not that previous suspension is unrelated to that current suspension, but that student can't be penalized after for that same act, right? For that same behavior after returning to school. They've served their time. That's it. That event happened. It's in the past. We're moving on. Okay. That student should not again be penalized for the same act. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. So when we think about due process, right, we know that federal due process rules or procedures, regs should apply when it comes to charter schools, do apply when it comes to charter schools. And when we think about due process, the importance of due process is to ensure that individuals' rights, right, certain rights that they have are upheld. One of those things being notice. Before I jump into this slide, perhaps someone can put into the chat, why do we think it's important for notice to be provided from an administrator regarding a student's suspension, regarding a student's expulsion to that student's family? Why do we think notice is important? And this is certainly a tricky one, but it's definitely an important one. And I'm certainly happy we're discussing this today. Why do we think it's important for notice to be provided to a family regarding a student being suspended or expelled from school? Seeing some engagement in the chat. As always, thank you guys for the wonderful engagement. This is certainly a tricky question, so I certainly understand people taking their time to think deeply. So, you know, just considering the time here, right? I know we're running on an hour or so. Let's talk about it, right? Notice is important, very important. And why? So, it's important for a family to be communicated with about what is happening with their child. Certainly when it comes to that child being disciplined, right? Parents have a right to notice of the charges and the basis of accusation. So you are required to have information, be provided information regarding why your child was suspended, why your child was expelled, the basis of their suspension, the basis of their expulsion. right? You also have the right to notice before the suspension, right? So before a formal decision comes down from administrators regarding your child being suspended, being expelled, you have a right to be provided information about that. Okay, that decision, unless the student poses a continuing danger or ongoing threat of disruption to the school community. You also have a right to notice as soon as possible after the suspension if immediate removal is allowed. So, say the school does decide that the student does pose a continuing danger, ongoing threat, and they suspend that student without providing you prior notice. Immediately afterwards, they must provide you with that notice. You must be aware of what is happening with your child. You must be in communication with the school regarding what is happening with your child. Next slide, please. Okay, another important due process right, the right to be heard. Students have the right to an explanation of the evidence and a chance to tell their side of the story before they're suspended, unless there's a continuing danger to people or to property, or thanks, or an ongoing threat of disruption to the academic process. However, even though a student has a right to explain the evidence that may be provided against them, a student cannot be forced to give a statement against their own interests. I will emphasize this again. A student cannot be forced to give a statement against their own interests. Incredibly important. Next slide, please. So, let's talk about the length of suspensions. So, for long term suspensions, which are 11 days or more, and I do believe this 11-day or more um, provision or section really applies to DOE schools. Oftentimes, what I've seen, at least when it comes to charter schools, is that long term suspensions actually, you know what? No, I'd say long-term suspensions are probably 11 days or more as well in the charter school context. However, make sure that you are clear on that, and you will find information regarding the length of suspensions, right? Short-term and long-term in the student handbook. If it's not clear in the handbook, make sure you ask the school. So for long-term suspensions, which are 11 days or more, charter schools must follow more formal procedures. One, the student must prove the charges at the hearing. So there must be a suspension hearing where a student has been suspended for 11 days or more. The hearing officer must be impartial and base their decision on evidence presented at the hearing. Now, I will say this. What's interesting about hearing officers in the context of suspension hearings for charter schools is that many charter schools do allow one of their own, an administrator, someone tied to the charter school, to actually preside over the hearing as the neutral hearing officer. Um, Again, keep in mind that this hearing officer should be neutral despite their ties to the school, right? And they should be reviewing the evidence, hopefully, in a fair way, both sides' evidence in a fair way. Parents have the right to call witnesses, submit evidence, and be represented by counsel. If you find that, hey, you just feel like you are not provided enough time to find witnesses, to retain counsel, right? To make sure that you're in possession of all the evidence or all of the information pertaining to your child's suspension, definitely know that you can submit a request to have the suspension postponed. Okay. I know that oftentimes folks feel like they're coming up against the clock here. If you find just not enough time for me to get all these things together, definitely reach out, definitely communicate to the school team and ask for a postponement. I cannot promise that that school will respect or abide by that postponement, but it's important that you just speak up and you speak out. Okay. And hearings must be on the record. Okay. There must be a recording of that hearing. In very few instances have I come across charter schools that provide transcripts of hearings, but they should record it, okay, so that uh, you have a record of what happened. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's say a student is suspended, we get to that suspension hearing, and a final decision comes down. A final decision comes down that you perhaps do not agree with. You can appeal that suspension decision. Okay, I'll say that again. You can appeal that suspension decision. The procedures, how to go about an appeal for such decision should be included in where the trustee charter school handbook. However, again, if you find that you can't find it on the website, definitely make sure you reach out to a school administrator to get that handbook, right? Again, you can appeal a decision. Grievance procedures come from the New York State Charter Schools Act, not individual school policies. You have a right to appeal, a huge, important part of due process. Appeals go to the Charter Schools Board of Trustees, the Charter Schools Authorizer, and the Board of Regents. If you want to figure out how to communicate with these folks, again, their information should be included in the handbook. However, where it's not, go to that front desk, reach out to that administrator, that vice principal, that principal, and inquire about their information. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about how suspensions work with students who are identified as students with disabilities, right? Special education students. So, as we spoke about earlier, charter schools may be these special independent public schools who, in some areas, right, in some instances, certainly have their own set of rules and regulations that they follow internally and externally. But as we know, there is certainly, right, there's overlap, there's intersection with the Department of Education when it comes to overseeing matters pertaining to students with disabilities. So, in the case of disciplinary actions taken against students with disabilities, the Committee on Special Education, the CSE, must conduct expedited evaluations and hold MDR meetings. What are MDRs? MDRs are known as manifestation determination review meetings. We will talk about that, I believe, in the next slide. But before we get to that slide, I just want to reiterate that charter schools must also hold MDRs for students with 504 plans as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is an MDR? An MDR is a meeting to decide if, and this meeting, again, is relevant in the context of students with disabilities, so a student with an IEP. It's a meeting to decide if the student's behavior was caused by the student's disability or a result of the school's failure to follow the student's IEP or BIP. I'll say that again. It's a meeting to decide if that student's behavior was caused by that student's disability or if it was a result of the school's failure to follow the student's IEP or BIP, where it's found that the student's behavior was caused by their disability or a result of the school's failure to follow the student's IEP or BIP. Essentially, the student and the student's family prevails at the manifestation determination review meeting. Okay? And when I say prevails, I mean that student should be returned to the classroom immediately after that decision comes down or that conclusion comes down. Okay? An MDR is required when a student is suspended for 11 or more days in a row within 40 school days or with a pattern, or if they display, right, a certain pattern of behavior. So at the end of each school year, folks, if your child has an IEP, I would certainly recommend, if they have an IEP and if they have been subjected to suspensions, certainly during the school year, I would definitely make sure you go back, you keep track, you review what happened, and you determine, right, whether or not MDRs were had, right, whether or not they were provided to the family. I would certainly say that an MDR is certainly an instance, a meeting where if translation is needed, or excuse me, interpretation is needed, interpretation should be provided. Okay. And Again, if you get to that MDR and you find that interpretation is not being provided, you certainly have the right to postpone or request for a postponement of that MDR to ensure that an interpreter is obtained for the next meeting. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. So just to reiterate, if it is, if the conclusion is yes, this was a manifestation, right? The student returns to school. The CSC should conduct or may conduct a functional behavioral assessment, an FBA, or a behavior intervention plan, a BIP. Um, a parent's consent is certainly needed in these instances. And so definitely want to look out for next steps after the MDR and whether or not you're provided communication, you're provided resources, or excuse me, you provided information about these evaluations and this intervention plan, a BIP, a behavior intervention plan. Okay. If it's decided that no, this was not a manifestation of the student's disability, the suspension does continue, and the CSC must consider doing an FBA and a BIP and determine placement and services during the suspension. So, when a student who has an IEP is suspended, alternative instruction should be provided to them. What do I mean by alternative instruction? I mean that schoolwork, right, should be provided to them to ensure that they are keeping up with their classes. What you'll find is that in the DOE context, there are I do believe that when students are suspended, they are essentially sent to another building to receive instruction. Oftentimes, you will not find that that happens in the charter school context, in the charter school world. Alternative instruction instead, right? Homework, classwork should be provided to them to be completed outside of the classroom, outside of school. Okay. If you find that alternative instruction has not been provided to your child, definitely reach out to the school, definitely inquire, especially if it is a long-term suspension, 11 days or more. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. Some charter school takeaways, everyone. Charter schools cannot refuse to educate English language learners or students with disabilities. Charter schools should offer specially designed instruction to students with IEPs who need unique supports and services. Remember, a charter school cannot state, oh, we can't offer all of the services that this IEP requires. They need to find a way to do so. Students suspended from charter schools get due process and alternative instruction, right? There's notice, there's a right to be heard, there's a right to an appeal, there's a right to be receiving classwork, homework while a student is suspended. And make sure students with IEPs get, or, make sure that manifestation determination review meetings are scheduled when a student with an IEP is suspended. Next slide, please. Okay, so that is the end of our webinar for today.